Welcome back for day 2 of Capitol Hill Ocean Week. Yesterday, for those of you who were here, saw a slide that Linwood Pendleton showed that featured some authors who've been writing about the sea over the course of our history. John Steinbeck, Robert Louis Stevenson, Herman Melville. This morning, I'm honored to welcome authors in today's world who have written some wonderful and inspiring and informative books about our ocean. Again, underscoring the connections that we as a nation and we as a culture have to the sea. One note, please, at the end of this discussion, there'll be some opportunity for talking with the authors and purchasing books over here to my left, and then having them signed by our distinguished authors this morning. Leading our discussion is Jim Delgado. Jim is Director of Maritime Heritage for the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries within NOAA. And Jim is a giant in the field of maritime heritage. He's well known for his work on iconic shipwrecks, in particular the Titanic, as well as the USS Arizona. And he's been featured on the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, ABC, to name just a few. He's been in the field for 40 years, and he's written 32 books. I don't know, Jim, you've been slacking off. That's not quite 10 per decade. Most recently, his work is Silent Killers, Submarines and Underwater Warfare. And we'll hear a little bit about that this morning. Jim's a fellow of the Royal Geographic Society and a member of the Explorers Club, and over the last 2 years has become a good friend and colleague of mine. Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Jason. What he failed to mention is that at least half of those books required the purchase of crayons. So that helps inflate those numbers. Well, it is indeed an honor and a privilege to share the stage with these colleagues, in particular in the time-honored tradition of writing about the sea and our relationship with the sea. There is nothing more, I would submit, that defines us as humanity than our relationship with the vast ocean from which we all sprang and which has played a dominant role not only in our history, but indeed in our very lives, down to the cellular level. Exploring that relationship, grappling with it, and assessing not only the consequences of the sea's influence on us, but indeed increasingly our influence on the sea, is the subject of much of the work that you're going to be hearing about today, but in particular in this anniversary year of great maritime events. It's particularly fitting that we will be speaking of the War of 1812 and the Navy's role, indeed a defining moment in the history of the U.S. Navy. We'll be looking at the power not just of words, but of images in bringing back a sense of a great part of our planet which remains virtually unknown to many people. We'll be examining the consequences, indeed, of our impact on the ocean, and I think getting a health card, an assessment, a checkup health card on the oceans. And we also will be talking about the power of the sea in its many forms as witnessed in a variety of events, including the most recent tsunami. I'd like to start by introducing each one of the panelists in a little more detail, and you'll have to bear with me. My once encyclopedic memory now has been so cluttered in the information age, I can't even remember the metro stop I'm supposed to take to get here this morning. So with that, bear with me as I just quickly catch from my notes to talk a little bit about each of these individuals, none of whom I think really needs an introduction for all of you because you wouldn't be here if you didn't know about them. But we'll start with Callum Roberts, a marine scientist, a conservationist who hails from the University of York in England, and whose tremendous book, The Unnatural History of the Sea, I think really sets the stage and also sets a bar that is very high in writing about ocean consequences. It talked about 1,000 years of hunting and fishing and ocean life, and it won the 2008 Rachel Carson Award. It really talks to the extraordinary rise and fall of fisheries over time, and in particular shows how life can make a remarkable comeback. if protection's granted, something, of course, that's near and dear to all of us who work in the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries. At the University of York, Hallam and his team have provided a scientific case for the world's first network of high seas marine reserves in the North Atlantic that in 2010 placed nearly 300,000 square kilometers of ocean under protection. He works with a number of environmental charities and with the World Wildlife Fund UK ambassador. He's a trustee of SeaWeb, Fauna and Flora International, and the Marine Foundation, and is an advisor to Save Our Seas. And his next book, Oceans of Life, explores how oceans are changing under human influence. And indeed, a powerful new book. And fortunately, out just in time. I'm going to also not be remiss and note every time I throw up one of these books to show you it is a not so subtle reminder that they're here and available to be purchased and assigned. Authors need to eat too. I'm going to then talk now about our good friend Bruce Parker, colleague of ours from NOAA. He came to the sea at a very early age, working with his father, scuba diving and water skiing in the Bahamas. Over the years, he's mixed his encounters with the sea with an academic background and with research, and eventually has become a world-recognized expert in oceanographic subjects that he talks about in Power of the Sea. He's a former chief scientist of the National Ocean Service at NOAA and is a visiting professor at the Center for Marine Systems at the Stevens Institute Technology. Dr. Parker's PhD is in physical oceanography from Johns Hopkins. He's also a former director of Coast Survey Development Lab and the former director of the World Data Center for Oceanography. And his book, indeed a very topical and timely book, as I said, is this one. We're also very fortunate in that we are joined by Brian Scarry. I've known Brian for a long time. We don't often get to encounter him much because usually he's out traipsing around the world in pursuit of tremendous images that help tell those stories that 1,000 words cannot. He's a photographer who specializes in marine wildlife and underwater environments. Since 1998, he's been a contract photographer for National Geographic magazine, covering a wide range of subjects and stories. He's an award-winning photographer. He's praised worldwide for his authentic sense as well as his journalistic drive for relevance. His uniquely creative images, I think, have done so much for all of us, and they do powerfully convey the sense of the oceans. One of his photographs was recently selected by National Geographic as one of the top 50 images of all time, and this is his book, and a tremendous one it is. Last, and certainly not least in this anniversary year, is Mark Collins Jenkins. Mark's book, tremendous achievement, documents the history of the Navy and the War of 1812. He's a former archivist at National Geographic. He's written on a wide range of historical topics, including the Civil War, uncovering the origins of an enduring legend, and looking at vampire forensics, and a number of other books, which I think graphically, dramatically, and powerfully interpret our relationship to the world and to subjects like the War of 1812, a largely naval and maritime war. With that introduction, I'd like now to call up our first panelist to speak about his book, Bruce.
Thanks, Jim. With these lights glaring at us, I'm not sure if I can see your time's up sign, but I will try to notice it. When you're used to giving like an hour presentation on your book, 6 minutes is a little confining. So obviously I can't really go through the book, but I think I'm going to concentrate on one of the questions that usually comes up in Q&A after the book, which is why did you write the book? Why do people write books about the ocean? And there's really three reasons. The first one is to entertain, and if you don't do that, the next two reasons aren't really going to happen. Because the second reason is try to give the general public some idea of the impact that the ocean really has on their lives. Because as much as they may watch some of the nature shows and they really like the dolphins and that kind of thing. They frequently don't really get a sense of just how critical the ocean is to us. And then the third reason, of course, is if you can convince them of the second reason, then maybe you can get them to support ocean programs. And if those readers happen to be congressmen or their staffers, so much even the better. So when I wrote this book, I'm writing basically a popular book on ocean physics, not exactly the topic that most popular books are written on. So how do you get across to the public the importance? Well, I chose marine prediction because marine prediction, besides being fascinating to us physical oceanographers, can be extremely dramatic because marine prediction really does save lives. And over the centuries, literally for 2,000 years, mankind's been trying to predict when the sea's going to turn its power against them so they can get out of the way. Because you can't control the sea. The only way to survive is to try to get out of the way when that storm surge from a hurricane floods the coast, or when the tsunami hits, or when large waves are out there, or a rogue wave splits your boat in half or capsizes it. So, and ocean physics is kind of the essence behind marine prediction. So when I wrote this book, I decided that I would interweave stories of really dramatic marine disasters over the centuries, and then interweave that with not just boring textbook science, but actually stories about how marine scientists, how philosophers, whoever it was, slowly learned to understand the physics of the ocean and eventually predict those terrible phenomena. Now, not all of them, of course. We still can't predict tsunamis, although we're on the verge of predicting when rogue waves are going to hit. We still haven't done that. As we get off into the more long-term stuff like El Nino and climate change, there are still some difficulties there. But the essence was I started with the tides because that was the only thing prior to the 20th century that we learned how to predict, although crudely. But even the ancients saw the correlation between the tides and the moon. Then storm surges, the biggest killer of them all. Literally millions upon millions of people have been killed by storm surges over the centuries. And we eventually, once we invented models and satellites to observe where the hurricanes were and better weather forecasting of gales, now can do an extremely accurate job of predicting storm surges. Wind waves were even more difficult than storm surges, and it took till World War II to predict those, and rogue waves, as I say, isn't quite there yet. And tsunamis, we still can't predict. Where's the clicker? Red button? Green. Okay. So I already have used up half my time. So the book starts out with 2 chapters on tide predictions because those were the first marine predictions. Now, since most of this book is about natural disasters, you don't really think of the tide as being something that can kill people, but actually, especially in the early centuries, it really could kill people. There could be tidal bores in certain rivers where rivers narrow down, have a large tide range, and the tide turns into this perpetually breaking wave that goes up a river and flips over ships and that type of thing. You can have tidal whirlpools. For example, when strong tidal currents go through narrow channels that widen out, and the most famous being the Strait of Messina off between Sicily and Italy, which back in the days of Homer, when he wrote the Odyssey, and he talked about these 2 monsters, Scylla and Charybdis, and Charybdis was supposedly this monster that would suck ships underwater and then spit back black water and sediment and that type of thing. And he was describing a real-life whirlpool, tidal whirlpool, that really could kill people in the Strait of Messina. And then, of course, even, in very large tide ranges where you may have a 30, 40, even 50-foot tide range, and when the tide's out and there are hundreds of square miles of mudflats and fishermen run out there to dig up shellfish, you got to know when the tide's coming back or you're going to drown. So that was like really the first use for trying to predict the tide, and they did it according to the moon overhead. Likewise, ship captains, they had to bring the ships in at high tide so the ships wouldn't run aground. But even after that, aside from the natural disasters, there were important moments in history where the tides were critical. And in the book, I go into the story of the tide predictions for D-Day and other stuff. Got a minute left. Then storm prediction, storm surge prediction, which basically, as I said, this is an etching from 1600s dealing with this storm surge that killed 80,000 people on the German coast of the North Sea. Even in the United States, the Galveston storm surge in 1900 is the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. Probably at least 8,000 people died, and that was the subject of another book, Isaac's Storm. The most devastating happened in the Bay of Bengal, where literally millions have been killed over the centuries. And in 1970, in fact, it led to the War of Independence with Bangladesh because it killed 500,000 people. West Pakistan ignored it, and a whole chain of events happened. Wave prediction, as I said, is even more difficult because literally waves can hit your coast coming from thousands of miles away. And now with global models and satellites, the surfers love that. They can tell when a storm off of Japan is sending waves to the beach of California. But in the past, it meant that it was really difficult. And they used to see it in the ships. They used to see lighthouses wiped off the face of the earth. Eddystone Light on the right there was rebuilt 4 different times. In the book, because of the scientific stories, there's even a great story about Ben Franklin, how he figured out how wind generates waves. There's a comical aspect, which if someone wants to ask me in Q&A, I would tell since I'm running out of time, but he was such a character. But it was World War II where Monk and Schredrick finally developed a reasonably crude sea swell and surf forecasting to use on the Normandy beaches of World War II, and that story's in the book too, and is really quite fascinating because it had such an impact on the war that people don't realize. And of course, during World War II, the Queen Mary was almost capsized in 1942 with 16,000 troops on it, heading for Scotland by a rogue wave. And so the book also talks about rogue waves, how you can predict them, why they were so ignored for so long. Tsunami predictions in quotes, because basically we can't predict them because we can't predict the submarine earthquakes that produce them. Once they're produced, we have great models to say when they're going to show up. But if you're very near the epicenter, like in Sumatra, which literally was 15 minutes of travel time from the epicenter for when the tsunami hit it, 100-foot wave, 300,000 people killed, 200,000 in the first 30 minutes. That's not prediction. I mean, it's fine, like, for example, if Japan, we knew at Hawaii how long it would take to get there, but very close to Japan, there was no way to predict it in time. And then once it was predicted, there's a chapter added to the paperback of my book called The Unpredictable and the Unprepared. And you would think Japan, the most tsunami-aware country on earth, would not lose 20,000 people to a tsunami. But the fact is, another reason for writing books is that you must know about history, because those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. And there had not been a really deadly tsunami since 1933. And the Japanese basically just got complacent. They had seawalls that were not high enough, hence the problem at the power plants. And the schools, the stories about the schools in the paperback version of my book, and how tsunami awareness saved all the children in one school district while others were dying by the thousands is a pretty amazing story. So I guess I'll stop there and pass it on to Mark Jenkins. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. One nation shaped by the sea. Well, we could call the War of 1812 one navy shaped by a war, because it's really what happened in the 2.5 years that the War of 1812 was fought. It was the coming of age of the U.S. Navy. Before that, the Navy was struggling for its existence. It had been sort of founded as a continental navy, but after the War of Independence, that was kind of disbanded because we couldn't afford it, and troubles with affording a standing navy dogged our nation for the first 20 years or so of its existence. And it was only when Barbary pirates began preying on our commerce that we decided, well, maybe we really ought to get a navy up here, because we can't afford this, because we really were a nation shaped by the sea in the 1790s and the first decade of the 19th century. Almost all of our commerce was seaborne. Even all the grain farmers out in what was the West, which we now think of as part of the South, but they were mostly shipping their grain out through New Orleans down to the West Indies. So, when the Napoleonic Wars came up, and both Britain and France began squeezing the carrying trade and we were the largest carriers. Our commerce was, our very vitality as a nation was at risk. One side would say something like, well, if we catch you at all trading with the British, we're going to consider you tantamount to trading with the enemy, and we will seize and sequester your ships. The British will come back and say, well, if you actually obey Napoleon's edict, we're going to seize and sequester your ships. So there wasn't much room for our nation to budge, and Thomas Jefferson made perhaps a not very wise decision when he decided to do a complete embargo on all American trade, thinking that would bring the combatants to heel and realize the error of their ways, because they were living off of American wheat as well. Well, that was a disaster. Our foreign commerce just plummeted, almost collapsed. So our tiny little Navy, 18 ships, 16 ships I think it was that we started the war with, set off in June of 1812 to fight the British, mostly because it was the British who were the obvious enemy. They were hanging off of our coasts. They were raiding our warships and impressing our seamen, claiming that they were actually not born in Britain, and a lot of them were. They were hassling our commerce, and they were the obvious target because they had actually bottled up Napoleon's fleet in the continent. So our little 16-ship Navy takes on the 800-ship Royal Navy, the mightiest fleet on the planet. And yes, a lot of the Royal Navy ships were bottling up Napoleon. They were in every sea of the world, but still. What happened was nobody had beaten a Royal Navy ship in single combat anyway for a number of years. But in 2.5 years of war, our little Navy really acquitted itself very, very well. Had the Royal Navy kind of soul-searching a little bit as to why this little upstart nation was beating its famous cruisers at sea. And although we hear about the Baltimore, Fort McHenry, we hear about the Battle of New Orleans, it really was a far-flung sea war. It was fought in every single ocean on the planet, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, the Atlantic, even on the edge of the Arctic. One of the more famous battles took place right off the coast of Brazil. That was made famous in a Patrick O'Brian novel. Those of you who are devotees of sea literature, that's from the Java, was sunk by the Constitution. One of the more interesting stories is the story of the Essex, and that was commanded by David Porter, whose son became a very famous Civil War admiral in later years. And he took the Essex down the South Atlantic, and then when he figured he got trapped and he couldn't do anything, he decided to go around Cape Horn, raid British whalers in the Galapagos Islands, because they were getting the whale oil that was keeping the lights of London aflame. And but David Porter was one of these interesting guys, and he spent as much time doing natural history observations and making notes in the Galapagos. This is a few years before a certain Charles Darwin goes down there, as he did raiding the British whaling fleet. And Darwin actually came across his journal, his story of his Pacific cruise, and nodded approvingly at Porter's observation that each island in the Galapagos seemed to have a different species of turtle. Anyway, the British come after Porter. They can't find him, and it turns out that they didn't know it at the time, but that he had made a getaway to the Marquesas Islands. And then you have a little sort of a mutiny on the bounty kind of scenario as on the island of Nuka Hiva, these American tars get a little involved with the native women, and they get involved with these native wars, and Porter, to make a long story short, because the hook is approaching me, Porter actually has to quell a mutiny. A mutiny does, in fact, occur after he leaves in one of the ships. But one thing he does is he claims the islands for the United States. But back in Washington, President Madison and Secretary of State Monroe didn't pay any attention to that. But just think, if they did, and the Marquesas became a kind of proto-Hawaii and U.S. territory. What a nice marine sanctuary that would prove to be. So I must go, but Callum, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here and to find out at last what I'm going to talk about. What I wanted to try and do was to give you a sense of the challenges involved in writing a book which is very comprehensive and quite technically challenging, because the oceans themselves, the whole history of the oceans, the physics of the oceans, the chemistry, these are quite technically challenging subjects. And particularly what I wanted to try and do in writing my books is to reach out to people who are not necessarily immediately technical, people who would just want to read something because they were interested in it, they had a fascination about the subject, and they could learn a little bit more about it and get into more depth. And one of the things that I want to try and do in my books is to inspire people to care more about the subject that they're reading about. The oceans desperately need more in the way of care from us, and better governance, better stewardship. So in order to get that message through, you have to first of all entertain and enthrall, I think. And so one of the things that I'm really trying to do when I start thinking about a subject, and for example, ocean circulation, is to find stories that can anchor that and tell about the physics of the oceans through those stories. And one fascinating tale that I came across in writing my book is the well-known story of Benjamin Franklin, really, when he was Postmaster General. And this was in pre-revolutionary America, and he was responsible for the transit of mail across the Atlantic. And he was curious as to why it took ships from London 2 weeks longer to reach the Americas than it took them going the other way. And so he thought about this, and it wasn't because they were stopping in the Azores for a cup of tea on the way across. It was actually to do with the ocean circulation. And so he got together with a cousin of his, Timothy Folger, who was a whaling captain, and together they amassed all of the information they could find on the observations of currents that those whaling captains had made. And he came up with the first and remarkably accurate map of the Gulf Stream. What was interesting, though, and is somewhat less well known, is another of his contemporaries called Benjamin Thompson, who was born in New Hampshire, and he fell on the other side of the conflict and ended up being a loyalist. And he was also very interested in physics and chemistry and the oceans and various things. And there was one single observation of the temperature from about 1,000 meters down, made in the tropical latitudes of the Atlantic. And that one single observation told him that it was much, much colder down there. And that got him thinking, why is it cold in the deep sea? And that must be because cold water sinks at the poles and then travels deep down in this kind of deep water circulation, and therefore the water at the surface must actually travel up to the poles as well. And he said there's plenty of evidence to indicate that this is true. Well, he was vindicated by science later on, and we have the global overturning circulation. But it's just fascinating how a single observation, one measurement, can tell you such a great deal about the way that the oceans work. But there are some things where there's no witness to a story, and so you have to use your imagination to some degree. And so, for example, when you're going back to the very, very early history of the planet, 4.5 billion years ago, we have the testimony from the rocks and very little else. But one of the fascinating stories that I found was the story from the zircons, and these tiny little crystals are about the size of a grain of snuff, if we keep in the Benjamin Franklin era. These crystals can tell us, how old they were when they were formed from the uranium-lead ratio. And we know that they're some of the oldest rocks on the planet. There are some that are 4.4 billion years old. And from tiny little inclusions in those crystals, we can tell that they formed in contact with liquid water. And so now immediately we have a story about the Earth as being a much cooler place, more like a sauna than a raging inferno at about 4.4 billion years ago. And I think that's a fascinating way that you can connect people to a story that none of us could have experienced. And then another thing that I try to do is to write in an entertaining way and inject a little bit of humor from time to time. And this is a point where you have to fight with your editor, because sometimes editors don't like humor in serious books about the ocean. And so you'll be glad to know that I left all the humor in there, despite my editor's entreaties to cut out things which I thought were funny, but I won't tell you about any of them now, because my time is running out. But the other thing I also like to do is to try and introduce literary and art into the books, literature and art, in a way that will bring in readers who come from a humanities perspective. And so, for example, the story The Old Man and the Sea is a wonderful one of looking at a sea that is full of sharks and enormous creatures. And Winslow Homer painted a magnificent image of the Gulf Stream, which has all these sharks kind of leaping up around a sailor on a shipwrecked boat. And if you want to have a stare at that, you can either go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or you can have a look in my book afterwards. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to somebody who is a master of the visual arts, and that is Brian Skerry.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Callum, and thank you all for being here. My new book, Ocean Soul, is a photo book. I actually would have been quite content to have only pictures in it. Those are the only books I read, usually are the ones with photos. But the publisher said I needed words, so I did write some words as well. But Ocean Soul is essentially a mid-career retrospective. Mid-career because I'd like to think I still have a few more years left in doing this. But it blends my work as a National Geographic magazine photographer covering ocean subjects with my experiences. The writing is about my experiences in the field. So it's a very personal book. And because it's a photo book, I brought along some photos here today. And whenever I have a captive audience here, I like to begin with pictures of myself as a child, which we see here. But this is sort of where it all began for me, actually, which is what the book is about. It's this personal story. This is in my parents' backyard swimming pool when I was about 5 years old. And incidentally, I think something happened when we scanned that old photo, which should say August 87 on the bottom on the date there. But this is where it all sort of began. When I was about 5 years old, dreaming about being an ocean explorer, reading National Geographic magazine, watching Cousteau documentaries, and wanting to become an ocean explorer with a camera. It was kind of a lofty dream for a little kid from a blue-collar town in Massachusetts, but dreams come true, and that's a big theme of Ocean Soul as well. Being a National Geographic photographer is all about exploration and discovery, which is what Ocean Soul is about for me as well. It's been described as a love story. If you read the dust jacket in the back cover, it says it's a love story about a kid who fell in love with the sea. And I think that's true. From those very first dives I made as a teenager, I fell in love with not only the sea, but with exploration and discovery of life within the sea. And the ocean still remains largely unexplored, so for a journalist and a photographer, it really is the perfect place to work, especially a wildlife photographer, because you never know what you're going to see on any given day when you enter the sea. I was interviewed by another magazine, a photo magazine, recently about my work, and one of the questions the interviewer asked me was, what did I think the most important photograph ever made since the history of photography began? Well, there was a temptation, of course, to pick one of my own, but I actually said this, and I'm probably not the first person to say this, but it bears repeating, because when we first saw Earth from space, I think we recognized many things about how fragile our planet is, but we could clearly see that we very much live on a watery world, a watery planet. It's often been said that about 3/4 of the Earth's surface is ocean, which is true, but I think maybe a more important statistic is that 98% of the biosphere, 98% of the livable, habitable planet is ocean. So it's, of course, in our very best interest to take care of this and be good custodians. So Ocean Soul, then, is really a personal exploration of this watery planet, photographically. It's about trying to peel back the layers of mystery that exist with ecosystems and wildlife underwater. My work has taken me to many different realms, and the book is sort of divided into almost temperatures. So I have sections on warm oceans, tropical places, as we see a photo here of an oceanic whitetip and a marine biologist in the Bahamas. Temperate water zones, here we see a little yellow goby living inside an abandoned soda can in Suruga Bay in Japan, temperate water zone. And icy realms as well. Here we see a photo of a harp seal pup swimming in 28.5 degree Fahrenheit water in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. So it's really about my personal exploration through all of these places. Like most photographers, I suppose, when I first began, I just wanted to make beautiful images of the animals and places that interested me. But there's been somewhat of an evolution in my career in that over time, I've seen a lot of degradation occurring in the world's oceans. I've been diving and exploring the oceans for about 35 years, and there's a lot of problems. And I felt sort of a sense of urgency and responsibility to begin covering some of those things as well, turning my cameras and lenses toward these issues, things that I think many people don't see. The ocean suffers from this fate of having this beautiful, calm exterior, and unless you're exploring it on a regular basis, you don't see the problems that are occurring. So in order to tell a more complete story, my work is shifted to a lot of these environmental issues as well. Here we see a dead thresher shark, this crucifixion picture that I made in Mexico, Sea of Cortez. But, the majority of the book is about celebrating the magnificence of wildlife in the sea and about these experiences I've had, swimming with a 45-foot, 70-ton southern right whale, an animal that had never seen humans before. These were just discovered a few years before I went there in the sub-Antarctic of New Zealand. It's sharing both the good and the bad. I thought I'd end with just a brief passage that I wrote in the final paragraph of Ocean Soul. I say the following. I say, "We are all connected to the sea and tied to her fate. The wounds suffered by Earth's oceans are not fatal. We can still turn the tide of past harm into a groundswell of future protection. Scientists have described what is happening to the heart of the sea. Images reveal her soul. With both as our guides, we can serve as vigilant guardians of the sea, and she will again thrive. I remain hopeful that her siren song will echo loud and clear and continue to seduce men and women of future generations to leave the safety of the water's edge and explore." Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I think that rather evocatively shows that you are indeed a master not only of the image but of words. In closing, before we open it up for questions, I'll just briefly talk, I guess because it is about authors, about my most recent book on submarines and our exploration and our use of the oceans through these incredible craft. In every case where I have been compelled to tell a story or to write a book, it has been because as an archaeologist and as a historian and as a former museum director, I find myself compelled not only by the things we make, but by the stories of the people behind them. Indeed, history at its best is about people. And in the case of submarines, I, of course, as a historian, have encountered tremendous stories of pioneers in submarine history, of bold explorers who built craft, sometimes fatally so, with bad consequences for themselves as they tested the edges of technology and the limits of human endurance in the deep. But also, too, the stories of those who had succeeded, be they the Simon Lakes, the John Hollands, the Don Walshes, the folks who boldly went and opened up the vast undersea world for us. While Silent Killers speaks in some sense with its title to submarines as an instrument of war, they also have played a powerful role in opening up the deep ocean for us, as we indeed saw last night with the award to Don Walsh for the epic dive that he made with Jacques Picard in the Trieste. It is indeed in these craft themselves, as well as the people, that I have found the impetus for telling stories. Whether it was dropping down to put my hand on an atomic warped submarine sunk by nuclear test detonations at Bikini, or seeing a surf-washed submarine from 1865 on a beach in Panama that turned out to be the world's oldest successful deep-diving submarine, albeit one which unfortunately was abandoned because its inventors had tackled all of the difficult challenges of making a sub that could descend to 100 feet and stay for hours and allow people to access the ocean. But the technology at the time, while providing that access, had not yet caught up with the consequences of people staying at depth under pressure for that period of time, and the crew all succumbed to decompression sickness. I think in this way, artifacts do speak powerfully to the human story, and that is what Silent Killers is about. It is more than just a history of the submarine. It's a look through the surviving craft in museums, those that sit on the bottom of the sea, and as well those that are known to us solely through imagery or descriptions from the past. My favorites in this are, of course, the stories that most of us have never heard that have come to light. People like Dr. Antoine Prosper Payen, who built the world's first successful lockout submarines to build harbor installations at Cherbourg. And we would not know much about them other than a few engravings and a wonderful and captivating account of diving in one with Charles Dickens. Others include diving bells, which helped us open up and access America's harbors, gave us our first glimpses as Americans of the undersea world, and indeed underscore our relationship as a nation of entrepreneurs and innovators, and in many cases with a number of these submarines, the type of thing that we still hear about and see today, the role of a few individuals working alone without big R&D budgets or the backing of a large corporation or government, literally doing it in some cases in their own backyard, like Simon Lake, like John Holland before the Navy adopted his submarines, and like people like Benjamin Malafert, a New York engineer who would become the Navy's first deep sea underwater demolition expert during the Civil War. Silent Killers, therefore, is not just an exploration of that which kills. It's an exploration of that which indeed opens up an important window to this most critical and important part of our planet, the oceans. So with that, and with thanks for letting me talk a little bit about my own, I'd like to throw it open now to the panel. I know that you all have questions, but I'm going to start with a provocative one to the group, and that is how, in the work you've done and in the books you've written and in your interaction with your audiences, how ocean literate do you find the average American to be?
I'll start first, only because no one else has said anything. The thing is, there's a difference between the audiences that are attracted to your book. When the book first came out, and then when I did, the paperback came out in March, I had to give a lot of talks, everything from universities to museums to aquariums to a whole variety of places. And the nature of the audience you attract actually tends to be someone who already is loving the ocean for one reason or another. I did the Maritime Museum down in Newport, and the average age was probably 50 or above, and they'd all been involved with the ocean at some point in their lives, so it's hard to really tell. So I put up a Facebook page for the book to try to appeal to like the groups that don't show up, the groups that don't already love the ocean. And at some point, I got up to like 30,000 likes, which does sound like a lot. I could tell they weren't all buying the book, or I would have seen my book skyrocket. But they loved the stories. I kept taking stories from the book and putting them on there, and other things I found and stuff. So that was one of my attempts to try to get to the audience I want to get to, not to the ones that already care about the ocean. So I'm begging out on the answer because I don't really know. I mean, I think I get a biased audience to my book talks, and it's really hard to tell how aware they are. But the one thing I want to remember to say now that I was going to say at the end of my talk was I'd encourage any ocean scientists in this book, in this audience, who care about some aspect of the ocean to try their hand at writing a popular book or a popular article, because the more that we write, the more we can get across how important the ocean is. And none of us, except maybe Callum or Brian, will be bestsellers, but as a group, we can start making an impact if we all keep trying to write these books.
Yeah, I would say that it's somewhat regional in terms of people's awareness about the ocean and particular issues. certainly as I've been touring around with Ocean Soul, when I'm on coasts, California or the East Coast, I think people might have a little bit more awareness about specific issues that are relevant to them. But I think there's an appetite for an interest in the ocean. Certainly when I do my speaking engagements, people seem to have a real interest in ocean wildlife, and in many cases, the things that I'm showing them through images about the problems in our world's oceans, pictures of bycatch from a shrimp boat or the shark in the net, and those kinds of photographs do resonate. I think they sort of wake people up to some of the issues that are happening. 100 million sharks being killed around the planet, or 60 billion pounds of bycatch every year. Most people didn't know about these things, and they seem to be willing to change their behaviors in terms of what they purchase, seafood and so forth, based on that awareness. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think there is an appetite and an interest to learn more once they're engaged.
I would agree that there's a great interest and enthusiasm for the oceans, and that's just a natural, innate part of being human, I think. If you look at any polling about the oceans, it almost universally comes up with very high figures for people who like or love the sea, who feel that it's important, who are concerned about the condition of the oceans. We all have this memories of seaside holidays when we were kids, and some of those are the most cherished memories that people have of their childhood, is when they went to the seaside. And I think that no matter how much or little you know about the oceans, we've all got that kind of hardwired connection, and that's something that a book can play on and reach out to when so if you can connect to somebody through that. I think it's very hard to be a bestseller with any oceans book. I think Brian's probably got the best chance out there of all.
I don't think
But it's hard to get a lot of copies into the hands of people. So I think it's well worthwhile trying what Bruce has said of putting the stories out there as well in a digestible and easily accessible form for people who don't pick up books and read them.
Yeah, if I recall right, Moby Dick was not a bestseller.
That's right.
My experience, well, it's a little bit like Bruce says, was that I always ran into the aficionados, people who just like to read, ocean literature, or Patrick O'Brien novels, or C.S. Forester novels, or just just kind of like the tang of salt in their books a bit. But for 20 years, being a historian at National Geographic, I used to, I was kind of the historian of our various ocean initiatives for a long time, and which the Geographic has done ever since. In one of its earliest presidents, actually, was another oceanographer named John Elliott Pillsbury, but. Despite decades of wonderful articles, despite really pioneering underwater color photography, one thing always showed up in the files, and that was impatient editors saying, "Not another ocean story." And you kind of scratch your head and go, and somebody said, "Well, it looks too blue." So on the one hand, you got the aficionados, on the other hand, you got people who just somehow don't. So I don't know. Those are the two poles of my observations.
The one thing that strikes me in what all of you have said is that there is a certain power, even if you are ostensibly writing for a niche. Never underestimate the power of the word and of the book to last, like Moby Dick, and to realize that the niche of today may expand and be yet another tomorrow. I think what I found in all of your work is that there is indeed messages that hit different audiences that people will find relevance in. And literature does have the ability to abide, whether it's on paper or in an electronic format. And in particular, what you said, I think, is powerful. There's a number of you in this room, I think, who have stories and who have compelling things to share. And there is admittedly some difficulty in sitting down in front of a screen and typing that first stroke, or if you're a Luddite like me, writing it out. But once you get past that and you literally break that ice, it's a wonderful thing to be able to share a story and to find, even in one reaction, that somebody's read it and gets the point. Any questions for the panel, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, sir.
I'm curious about the panel's reaction to something that concerns me quite a bit as a marine ecologist. We seem to have acquired the ability to get down to the bottom of the ocean. And that, we always hear this is great for economic development, you know, it's a political sort of viewpoint, and it sort of scares me half to death. And I wonder what you might think about how people have come to care about the sea. Now we're going to the bottom of it. Have we learned our lesson about depletion, about destruction of the coast, overfishing, all the rest? Are we going to carry this down to the whole bottom of the ocean, or will you fellas in all your books, and a couple that my wife and I have written as well, tell a story?
I'll start by saying that when I first looked at this submarine on the beach in Panama, I realized I could tell a story about history, but that there was something else. That sub did more than kill its crew. It was technologically advanced so it could go to depths of greater than 100 feet, and over the period of its time in Panama, it made a number of dives. It completely harvested not only the pearl beds, which had existed for a long time and which for centuries had provided riches, particularly for the ultimately formerly enslaved and now poor, but hard-working pearl divers of that archipelago. They had done so in what really would be called today a sustainable fishery, because it was with human breath and our ability to reach only so far. The submarine, in a matter of a month, wiped out the pearl beds completely to the point where they never recovered. So they destroyed the fishery with their ability to reach the bottom of the ocean. I'd like to think we learn from these things, but sometimes those stories are forgotten, and in that, I think that's why there's something in the power of a book. In my account of that submarine, I talk about that in the hopes that that lesson will be passed on. And indeed, if we don't tell the stories and share the stories, then I think we are doomed to repeat it. So, as an author, I felt particularly compelled to take that pulpit and share this account, not only of how smart we are, but the consequences of our technology, not only to ourselves, but to the ecosystem.
If I just add something to that, I think that the ability to exploit really deep down in the oceans is now just on our doorsteps, and everyone keeps telling me that it's 10 years before it will be economically viable really to start exploiting the deep sea by mining it, going for the extraordinarily valuable mineral resources there. And in my interactions with the International Seabed Authority folks in relation to the large marine protected area network that we've established in the North Atlantic, they were coming to this completely blind. They hadn't even thought about questions of conservation in the deep sea. It was merely about allocation. Who would you allocate the resources to, and how would you do it? The mining companies really haven't started to introduce conservation into their thinking about exploitation of the deep sea as yet. And so I think that the problem that we have is that organizations and groups have been talking to themselves for a very long time, and the challenge is to try and show people the big picture and where their activities sit within the big picture, and to try and encourage them to take a broader responsibility for what they're doing. And I think that it was extraordinary to me that they could have spent so long in the same world as we're in and conservationists are in without ever contemplating the possibility of the impact that their activity might have.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think part of the problem is that people historically have not taken ownership of the ocean. It's been seen strictly as a resource. In my comments, I mentioned that 98% of the biosphere is water on our planet. And as Callum said, with marine protected areas, only a fraction of 1% or so is actually protected. It's the tragedy of the commons where people just don't take ownership. I think we need to do that. The ocean not only suffers from having this beautiful exterior that hides what's going on below, but it's also viewed as limitless. It historically has been seen as endless bounty that we can just continue to go, but it's not. And this is a big focus on the work that I do with trying to make images that show these problems. When 90% of the big fish in the ocean have disappeared in the last 60 years post-World War II because of industrialized commercial overfishing, that's a pretty substantial amount of loss in the ocean. But yet, I don't know that that resonates with people. You can still go to a seafood restaurant and get a piece of fish, so we don't really think that there's a problem. And I think mining is probably in the same genre. I think we're going to look at that the same way. So we don't necessarily have an answer, but I think the quest, the challenge is to somehow raise awareness, get people to take ownership, get them to care about these resources and to preserve it. I think when I did a story on marine protected areas and the value of MPAs and how the ocean is resilient, it can come back. I went to New Zealand. It was in 2006, I did this story for the magazine, and it was because New Zealand was rather progressive in terms of protecting their EEZ, their exclusive economic zone. And I worked with a scientist there, Dr. Bill Ballantyne. And Ballantyne said, if you gathered a reasonable group of people anywhere in the world and said, less than a fraction of 1% of the world's oceans are protected, we want to protect 20 or 30%. Most people would say, that sounds fine. It's a replenishment zone. It's what we need for the future. Fishermen, everybody should understand that. But yet, that has not been the case. It's been a real struggle to get sort of any kind of protection enacted, and you're fighting constantly to do that. So, you raise a good question. Now, with technology, we're going to be able to go deeper and do it faster, and with mining and everything else. So I think the race is on to sort of get people to take ownership and to really raise that awareness.
Yeah, I kind of, you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but it was in the early 60s that Cousteau was prophesying the coming age of Homo aquaticus. And he was going. There are going to be these submarine cities on the continental shelf, and these sank conch shelf, 2 or 3 conch shelves down, not very deep, probably 100 or 200 feet. And in the 60s, all this stuff was really popular. All the Tektite stuff, the Man in the Sea projects, and all the aquanauts were the corresponded to astronauts. One's going that way, the other's going that way. Inner space, outer space, and then it seemed to kind of drop off a little bit, and at least popular interest did. And then many years later, somebody asked Cousteau about all this, and he just kind of gave this Gallic shrug and said, "Oh, it's complete fantasy." But it seems that I was reading something the other day where talking about again doing a lot more stuff on planning colonies, I don't know if colonies, but at least living quarters or research stations on the sea floor. And I guess that's what that's your deal. But
Interestingly enough, though, the world's only saturation facility for scientists is the Aquarius habitat down off Key Largo. I saturated in there back in 2001. I did a story about living on the bottom of the sea as an aquanaut. And, growing up in the 60s and 70s, you saw all those fanciful drawings and depictions about how the world was going to look in the 21st century. And today, that's the only remaining saturation facility for scientists, and it's lost pretty much all its funding. Don Walsh was telling me last night that it's probably going to go away. They don't even have enough money to extract it from the sea when it's all over. So it's sort of sad. I mean, the sort of wealth of information that can be gained by living in the sea in saturation, I think, is so valuable. And if we could have habitats like that in temperate water zones in various places around the world, it would be a great advantage. But so far, there hasn't been a will to do that.
Just one other thing. I mean, I think it's probably obvious, but the closer a marine problem is to the coast, the more you can get people to care about it, because you can see the impact on them directly. People can't go to their beaches. The beaches are closed, or they can't swim in a particular bay because of the pollution. As soon as you get out of sight from the coast, you get off into the deep water, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And then even in the scientific community, from the physics side of things, you say, well, it's also not as susceptible to pollution. We have a contained bay, we know, dumping lots of stuff into it, it takes a while for the tide to flush it out. But in the open ocean, you have such a volume of water, they think, it's going to be much less of a problem. But then as it turns out, I mean, with oil, certainly that wasn't the case. And even though the Gulf's relatively shallow, even off the East Coast or anywhere else, oil's going to have a problem. In terms of mining on the bottom, it's a little less clear, but chances are there are going to be consequences, and it may be a local place that zooplankton are growing, or it may be a local reef that it's affecting. But as long as it's sort of out of sight from the public and it doesn't affect them directly, it's such a harder sell to get them to care about it. And of course, marine sanctuaries have more than just the coastal ones. They have the offshore ones, and they're really making a difference in trying to educate the public of what the deeper places can mean to us.
Any other questions?
Okay, I'd love to actually, because Ben Franklin, to me, he's one of the founding fathers you can never overhype. This guy probably really was a genius, and there's more books about him, more stories about him, but one of the ones in my book I hadn't read anywhere else, and as an oceanographer and a waves person, I actually loved it a lot. But Franklin was on a British fleet of about 50 ships, this is before the Revolution, heading to Nova Scotia to capture a French fort. And he's on the stern of the ship, and he's looking out the back, and it's kind of a rough day, a blowy day with lots of wind, and each ship's setting up a wake. Now, he noticed on the back of his ship, the wake was really smooth, but behind the other ships, it was rough, and it wasn't just the wake, it was other waves on top of it. So he turns to the captain, he says, why is it so smooth? And the captain looks at him almost disdainfully, like anybody should know this, that the ship's cook must have been throwing greasy water out the scupper. Now, a light bulb goes on in Franklin's head, and he's read old stories, even back to the days of Plutarch and Aristotle. If you put certain oils on water, the waves disappear. So Franklin, being the ultimate experimenter, he tested this out. He's putting oil on waves and lakes and stuff, and sure enough, the waves are disappearing. So what he used to like to do, he'd take walks with his friends, and he would hide a little bit of oil in his cane. And when he'd come up to a lake where the wind was blowing and it was creating waves, he would take his cane like a sorcerer, and he would wave it over the water, and little drops of oil would fall down unknowingly as Franklin is saying, I will make the waves disappear. And sure enough, the waves disappear, and all his fellow colleagues, their mouths are just open like this guy is a magician. But he took that further, and in the book it describes how he actually learned how to understand how the wind created really large waves through resonance, and he used the analogy of the Liberty Bell and the fact that if you try to push the heavy Liberty Bell with your finger, it's too heavy, but if you push a little bit and it swings back, and you push a little bit more just at the right time period, and you keep doing it, keep adding energy, and pretty soon it's really swinging. And he used that to explain how the resonance and wind can create big waves. The guy, and this is 200 years ahead of his time without mathematics, the guy was pretty amazing.
One last question?
Just a general question. What's fascinating is that why has space captured people's minds and the oceans hasn't, when we've got all those incredible animals out there, and yet it's the stars that attract people's attention and so much money. Can anybody talk about that?
Star Trek?
Well, it's interesting to note that at the same time that Apollo 11 was approaching the moon, 7 individuals, including Jacques Piccard, were drifting in the Gulf Stream, and the Ben Franklin submersible on the first prolonged submersible mission in that mesoscaph. And their achievement was completely overshadowed by the landing on the moon, I think probably because it was out of the neighborhood and on that distant orb. And I think that that's unfortunate, because indeed the final frontier is here. And with 72% of the planet covered by the ocean, and with less than 5% of it really known, there is so much more to do. And perhaps one of the great challenges before us is to continue to write and to continue to share and to celebrate the achievements of people like Captain Walsh and others, and to share what has been found, and to remind the next generation that there really is opportunity There's opportunity to make a difference. There's opportunity to have a job and to have a career. There's opportunity to explore and to boldly go. And it's no coincidence, by the way, too, that when Gene Roddenberry did write his second series for Star Trek, the captain was named Picard. I think even he got it. Yeah, Dawn.
His son was with us last night, so he knows where
That's
the
right.
action is.
Absolutely.
So, So thank you for that round of applause for our wonderful panelists. You know, we think of storytellers in terms of fiction, but I think what everybody this morning really underscored is that even nonfiction really needs wonderful storytellers. And whether it's through the visual images from Brian Scarry or through the words, both written and spoken, that we heard this morning, it is all about telling stories. And if we're going to inspire the imagination of others beyond space into inner space in the ocean, it's going to rest with the fellows we have here on this panel.